So today we're going to do 2012 banking balance sheet FRQ for our notes, and we're going to go through this pretty quickly so that we can make sure that we have this under our belt one last time. This one's a little different than the ones we've done in the past, so that's a good reason to make sure that we practice these. Letter A says, what is the reserve requirement based off of the balance sheet? Now, looking at the balance sheet, we have our assets and liabilities. Remember, assets are what we own, liabilities are what we owe. Now, looking at the balance sheet, let's make sure we see that we have 15 and 85 is 100,000, and over here we have 100,000, so the two sides are equal. That's always the first rule of the balance sheet. We want to make sure that the two sides are equal. And when one side gets changed, the other side has to get equally changed. We want to always remember that. Remember as well, demand deposits are checking accounts. The vocabulary is without a doubt the enemy in this class. And so we need to make sure that we're practicing the vocabulary, going back to the Quizlets, going back to the flashcards, maybe making your own lists on other websites. That's totally up to you, but you got to practice the flashcards or the vocabulary. So the first question is, what is the reserve requirement? That's the same thing as asking, what is the reserve ratio? The Federal Reserve sets the reserve ratio, and the reserve ratio by definition is the amount of money that the bank has to hold on site as a percentage in a function of the demand deposits. So this bank has demand deposits of $100,000, and it is holding on site, that's what required reserves means, 10,000. So 10,000 of 100,000 means that the reserve ratio on this sheet must be 10%. So the reserve ratio is 10%. Now AP will expect you to be able to calculate 10% quickly and decisively. You got to be able to find that number. 10% is one of the easy ones, so we want to make sure that we can do that. No calculators allowed on the AP exam. So remember, reserve requirement is a function of demand deposits. And so the required reserves are of the demand deposits. So if we're holding 10,000 of 100,000, that's 1/10, that's 10%. Letter B. Assume that Luis withdraws $5,000 in cash from his checking account at Mi Tierra Bank. Mi Tierra, my land. So Luis withdraws $5,000 from this bank account. The question then says, what happens in B1 to its reserves based on Luis's withdrawal? This is a super simple question, and students always way overthink this. If Luis goes to the bank and wants cash, what does the bank have to do? Give him his money. So if Luis is taking $5,000 out of the bank, how much in reserves will the bank no longer have? $5,000. So the change is going to be by $5,000. This is the answer to B1. It literally is that easy. Remember, on the AP exam, if the answer is easy, it's probably right. And for simply understanding this question, we get a point out of 5 possible points on an AP exam. Remember, you only need a 55% to pass the AP exam. 55% gets you a 3. That gets you credit at U of I or any other state school. So let's make sure we get the easy stuff. B2 says, what is the initial effect of the withdrawal on the M1 measure of money supply? Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is always going to be something that students stumble on because we spend so little time on it. M1 is the portion of the money supply that is cash and checking. In other words, M1 is the portion of the money supply that's the medium of exchange stuff. Medium of exchange are the things that we pay with, whether that's a check or cash. Remember, cash can be coins or currency. Coins are literally the metal coins, sometimes commodity coins. The currency is the paper money. M2 is what we call our store of value. It's only our savings accounts. So the question is saying, how is this going to affect M1? This is a trick question, because here's what happens. Luis is taking $5,000 out of his checking, correct? But Luis took $5,000 in cash, correct? What that means is M1 stays exactly the same. Checking went down by 1,000, but cash went up by 1,000. That's in circulation with people. And as a result, the M1 stays exactly the same. Because all that happened is that the amount within M1 modified a little bit. We call this the composition of M1. Checking went down 5,000, cash went up by 5,000. That means M1 stayed exactly the same. Now I'm going to throw a little monkey wrench at you. Let's pretend it said that Luis moved $5,000 from his checking into his savings account. Can we pretend that it said that? If Luis moved 5,000 from checking into his savings, that would have meant then that M1 went down by 5,000 and M2 went up by 5,000. So this was a trick question because it wasn't affecting M2 at all. He withdrew from checking into cash. That means that even though the balance changed a little bit within M1, M1 stayed the same. So if you aren't sure of M1 and M2, make sure you look those up. They're on the website. You could Google them. These will be on the AP exam, at least 1 or 2 questions. Probably 1 question on the AP exam with M1 and M2. It's an easy one. Let's get it right. So there is no change. And if it said explain, and it does, you would have to say it doesn't change because only the composition changed. In other words, all the money stayed within M1. So finally, we get to B3. This is where it actually gets a little difficult. B3 says, as a result of the withdrawal, what is the new value of excess reserves on the balance sheet for Me Tierra Bank based on the reserve requirement in A? Okay. So here's what we have to do in order to answer this. Based on the withdrawal, it says. So Luis withdrew $5,000. We remember that. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to withdraw that $5,000. Now, the bank no longer owes him $5,000 because they gave it to him. Now, remember, if we subtract on one side, we have to subtract on the other. And so the first thing that a bank's always going to do is it's going to use its excess reserves to pay off debt. And so that's exactly what happened. We're balanced now. Look, 95,000 equals 85,000. This is a balanced bank sheet, but it is not reconciled. What we mean by reconciled is we have to make these numbers correct, the required and excess reserves. We've done this a couple times, and now we're going to itemize exactly what's happening here. In terms of demand deposits, they now have 95,000. The reserve ratio is 10%. That means that in required reserves, they have to have 10% of 95,000, which is $9,500. That means that the required reserves only need to be 9,500. Currently in required reserves, we have 10,000. That means there's too much there. So what happens is what is left over beyond the required slides down into the excess. That means the excess becomes 500 and the required is 9,500. How we solve this is that we took 10% of the demand deposits, compared it to what we already have. If there was extra, it slips into excess. That's how we do that. So the answer to B3 is $500. That is probably the hardest part of balance sheets, what we just did. There's no doubt in my mind that reconciling a balance sheet can be confusing. I've been there myself where I'm like, what am I doing wrong here? Why am I not seeing this? And so in this instance, the way to go about it is remember that you want to balance first, reconcile second. Reconcile means you make these numbers correct based off of this. That's the ratio. 10% goes here, any remainder goes here. So after with the withdrawal, we have to move the sheet around. The remainder goes into the excess. That is your answer to B3. So now finally, let's look at letter C. Letter C says, assume the next day John withdraws from Me Tierra Bank an amount that exceeds the bank's excess reserves. So assuming that no loans are called in, how can Me Tierra Bank cover its required reserves? This is an old school question, and this will be on the AP exam at least one time. What they are essentially saying is somebody comes in and closes their account. And if we don't have enough money to give them, how do we get the money to give them? See, here's the deal. If I come in and I want $10,000 out of the bank, right, that would make this $85,000, right, because I want the cash. They have to give me the cash. That's the law. So they're giving me the $10,000. They gave me all their money. Notice now they're stuck 0 and 0, right? This isn't legal. How much does this bank legally have to have on site? $8,500, right? So what's this bank going to do by the end of the day? It could be 3 in the afternoon. They close at 4:30. They're in trouble. They got to get the money now. How does the bank cover what are called the required reserves? There are 2 answers. The 2 answers are they have to A, call another bank. That's the most likely answer. And that means that they'll have to pay them the federal fund rate. They'll call the bank and say, hey, can I get a loan? I need an $8,500 loan to cover my required reserves overnight. We'll pay back tomorrow. And then they'll do that. And they'll have to pay them what's called the federal funds rate. This is what we pay, what one bank pays other banks for a loan. That was option one. Option two is that instead of calling a local bank, they'll get on the phone, they'll call the Fed. They'll say, hey, Federal Reserve, I need a loan to cover my required reserves of $8,500. Can I get a loan? The Fed will say, sure. And then they will have to pay the Fed the discount rate. That's what the discount rate is. It's what banks pay the Fed for a loan. Now, you might be wondering, which one would they call and why? That's actually a super easy answer. They'll call the cheaper one. Wouldn't you? Where are you going to go? Buy the $10 meal at McDonald's or the $8 meal at the other McDonald's? It's the same meal. So wouldn't you go to the $8 McDonald's? That's what people do. They go to the cheapest deal available. What to take from this? When a bank is short, they have to cover it by the end of the day. This is called being solvent or being secure. And so the bank is going to have to call another bank, or the bank is going to have to call the Fed for a loan. If they call another bank, they have to pay them the federal funds rate. If they call the Fed, they pay them the discount rate. These are for overnight loans, and those are interest rates that the bank has to pay.